Hello everyone! Super excited at the time that I am filming this. As far as I know, at the point of filming, this is the last of the virtual lectures that we have to do because this is the end of our 2-week quarantine window. So got my party hat on and we can start singing "Looks Like We Made It," right? Knowing my luck, I am going to get news shortly after doing this video that we're extending it for another week. But as long as the news is what I think it is, we are at our last one. So yay, go us. All right, last lecture we need to do here virtually. It is Global Issues 4.10, right? So this is one I was taking from the end of the semester and jumping it up here because we didn't have any vignettes assigned for this one. So Global Issues 4.10, this is Humanitarian Interventions. This is BSO Chapter 32, and we're looking at the impact of humanitarian interventions and how things have changed over time in terms of states getting involved in other states' business, okay? So, humanitarian intervention, what is it? We've got this definition from BSO, page 537. The principle that the international community has the right, nay, duty, to intervene in states which have suffered large-scale loss of life or genocide, whether due to deliberate action by its government or because of the collapse of governance. So what we're saying here is humanitarian intervention can go a couple of different ways. You can imagine something like the absolutely devastating famine/drought that took over the Sahel in the 1990s. Absolutely devastating. So countries like Sudan, like Mali, whether the government, you could say the government collapsed or just the government was fundamentally unable to deal with the catastrophe, the crisis, the large-scale loss of life due to the famine, all right? Same thing is happening in Yemen, right? A famine that has led to a lot of other challenges where you could say now it is the government attacking its own people. So humanitarian intervention could either be something like stepping in to intervene in the case of widespread famine, or stepping in and intervening in the case of something like genocidal activity, all right? Widespread loss of life. And it's this idea, if we go back to our lectures of theory here, hopefully it's pretty darn clear what theory this would be drawing on, the idea of I have a duty. We're bringing norms in here. I have a normative obligation to intervene as a state. So I understand that the Westphalian system is territory, sovereignty, autonomy, right? Sovereignty and autonomy here, huge here, but from a liberal perspective, I have the duty as the United States to break your right to sovereignty and autonomy if you are hurting your own people or if you can't help your own people. This is a fundamental shifting in the way we think about states, stateness, right? If we're saying that, okay, your stateness only extends so far. So another example you might get is the idea of a state's use of military force against another state, publicly stating its goal to end human rights violations in that state. So something like the US getting involved and doing things like drone strikes in Syria. We are attempting to combat the Syrian government's efforts to destroy its own people, to gas its own people, to bomb its own people, to murder its own people. So a state's use of their military force against another state, right? So this is very different than something like Doctors Without Borders going into Mali and providing food and health care in the case of a widespread famine. This version of humanitarian intervention is state military getting involved in another state. There's a nice overview video. I've linked it down below. You can get to it on the module page. It's just an overview of humanitarian intervention. We can pause now. You can pull up another screen. You can watch that video quickly and just get a little bit more background information on humanitarian interventions. Then we're going to dive into a couple of more things here. Before you go away, I'm going to take a second. I'm going to pause here. Oh, sorry, I've got a low battery light. Okay, hopefully you're still with me. I'm going to pause here for a second and give you the magic word. All right, you need to know this. The magic word is apple. Apple. Actually, no, I'll probably do it on this side. Apple. Picture. A-P-P-L-E. Okay? Magic word is apple. I'll see you in just a minute. Okay, so let's pause here for a second. I have this puzzle. I was talking about it before I went away, the idea of state sovereignty and security. And this challenge that, let's look at these couple of questions if you're looking at the PowerPoint slides. Sovereign states are expected to act as guardians of their citizens' security. That's the role of the state. They're supposed to protect their citizens. But what happens if states behave as criminals towards their own people, treating sovereignty as a license to kill? I am the state. I decide what goes, and I decide that you don't get to be in my state. I will murder you to make it happen. That has happened many times throughout the history of states. What does that mean? What does that mean for sovereignty if a government can twist the idea of sovereignty to be sovereignty is a license to kill? I'm supposed to be protecting you, but instead I'm going to use it to justify destroying you. All right? Comment down below if you have a thought about that, and we can build off of that. The second question here: should tyrannical states, should states that are murdering their own people be recognized as legitimate members of international society and accorded the protection afforded by non-intervention? We've talked about this. This is the root of the Westphalian system. Territory, sovereignty, autonomy. Since the end of World War II, we've talked about this many times, the idea of non-intervention. I have a right to my politics. I have a right to my state. You have a right to yours. Stay out of my life. I'll stay out of yours. Okay? Should this extend to a tyrannical state? A state that bombs its own citizens, a state that gasses its own citizens, a state that manufactures a famine because of the policies that it is pursuing in terms of agricultural production? Who has the right to decide? When have you crossed that line into being what we could call, quote unquote, a tyrannical state? When you are guilty of harming your own people, where is that line? Right? If you have ideas about that, or if you have examples that you're thinking of, that a state that could fit into that, maybe you have examples of states that did get in trouble, states that did cross the line and were sanctioned by the international community. What does that look like, right? Comment down below if you have any ideas, questions about this, okay? So as we're building forward, these questions were in the minds of states. They were in the minds of the UN Security Council, of the UN General Assembly. And over time, we've built out essentially two cases for humanitarian intervention, two, oh my gosh, what's the word? Two defenses that people have created for why this should be allowed. We have a legal angle here, and we have a moral angle. So legally, the term that we use here is called counter-restrictionism. Counter-restrictionism. There's these two broad claims within this legal argument of counter-restrictionism. The first one being that the UN Charter itself, 1945, the UN Charter is committed to states protecting fundamental human rights. States that sign on to this charter must protect fundamental human rights. Okay? There is also, from the law chapter, we know there's a whole world of customary law. Customary law is the idea of practice of states that gets repeated over and over again across a long time horizon to the point that it's just tradition. It's our tradition to protect our own citizens. You don't hurt your own citizens. It's customary that you do this. You protect your citizens. You don't harm them. There's also customary law support for intervention. And I gave a couple of examples here. Something like the U.S. intervention in Cuba in 1898. The British and the French and the Russian intervening in Greece in the early 1800s. There's a history here of states getting involved in the business of other states in a humanitarian intervention capacity. So states are building upon that, right? If that's the foundation brick, if 1837 or 1827 in Greece, then we get another brick, and we have 1898 with the US and Cuba. Then we get another brick, and right? And so you just keep building up a very strong foundation to your house that says, we have a legal standing. We can intervene in this case, and I have all this burden of legal proof to say, here's all the times we've done it before, we're going to do it again. Okay? So that's the legal claim. There's also, again, drawing very strongly on something like the liberal agenda, liberalism, the moral case for intervention. And here it's rooted very deeply in the idea of we share a common humanity. A common humanity. States have a responsibility to protect their citizens, and we as the common humanity have a responsibility to protect other humans in the event that the state isn't going to protect them. So those are the two big arguments people say. We have a legal argument, we have a moral argument. Very often they're clicking them together, right? And saying they're both apply, right? And that is how they get the, give themselves the permission to intervene. All right? So that's the four. If you click to the next slide, if you're doing that, you will see there are also a lot of cases against humanitarian intervention. So here are, this is directly from the book, page 517, if you want to follow along there instead, 7 key objections. Objections to this idea that states can intervene in cases of humanitarian emergency. So there are people that say there is no legal basis for humanitarian intervention, right? So that's interesting. You have people on one side saying there is a legal basis, the UN Charter, common law, customary law. There is legal basis. Other people are saying, no, that's not enough of a legal basis. That's, that is nothing, because states aren't beholden to the UN Charter. Yeah, the UN Charter is a thing, but I don't have to do what the UN Charter says. And there's no obligation, there's no impact for me if I don't agree to it. I can take my name off of it, and if I'm not a signatory, I'm not beholden to it. Okay? So the other challenge here with number 2, states do not intervene for primarily humanitarian reasons. This becomes a big challenge, especially if we are a little bit retrospective. If we look at our own behavior, many of us, since it's a U.S. institution, will go from the perspective of U.S. citizens. Our country gets involved a lot overseas, and a lot of people can make a pretty strong argument that we may say we're there for humanitarian reasons, but we also tend to have underlying reasons or more dominant reasons than, and also we'll try and save some lives. So just think of some of the different examples where we maybe have gotten involved. Could it not be that we were trying to secure oil or other natural resources? Could it not be that we're trying to secure phosphates? We're trying to secure gold, coltan, right? Things that we need access to, unfettered access to. So yeah, we may go in and say, those poor people in Congo, in DRC, we need to put a mission forward and help them. We can be doing that, yes, maybe, but we're also doing other things. Getting a boot on the ground in the guise of humanitarian intervention very often leads to boots on the ground in other ways. And so a lot of countries object to, I see you, I know what you're doing, you're going to come in here and try to fix things, but really you're just going to steal stuff from me. Okay, so they don't like it. If we look at number 3 then, states are not allowed to risk the lives of their soldiers to save strangers. This becomes a big challenge. We have heard this rhetoric before. We've heard, I know I certainly have heard it. I have a lot of military family in my background, so this has been a big challenge. Even friends of family that have ended up doing things like going and participating through the National Guard and being deployed to Africa to engage in things like vectoring of communities to stop the spread of Ebola. When my friend's family did that, when her brother went and did that, it was very much a fear and a concern of like, why am I sending my brother or my son to the other side of the world to vector for Ebola when he could catch it and die? Why would we send our own soldiers to do that? right? So there's a very real fear people have and a frustration people feel that that's not our job to do. We should not risk or expend our own citizens' lives to engage in something like that. Okay? So you can keep going through here and look at some of these other issues. You'll have read about them in the book because I know you're all reading, right? The bottom one just being the idea of like interventions don't work. And here it really is unfortunate that we can point to a lot of examples. So the one that sticks out most clearly to my mind would be something like the UN's attempted intervention in the Rwandan genocide. Complete and total failure. Just round failure. Didn't do anything that it was supposed to be doing. They didn't get the support that they needed. They didn't get the reinforcements that they needed. They were left out to dry. It's absolutely devastating. Okay, so there's more than one example. There's more than a few examples, which is why it's so unfortunate that interventions don't always work. They don't always go to plan. And so that can be a big challenge for people to feel like, what's the point? It's not going to work the way you think it is. Let's just do nothing instead. Okay. So you do have, though, in the 1990s, if you're looking at this next slide then, in the 1990s, we call this Humanitarian Interventions Golden Age. So you see here from 1991 through to 1999, all these missions, all these humanitarian intervention missions. Operation Provide Comfort in Iraq, the Unified Task Force in Somalia, UNAMIR in Rwanda. I just talked about that one, though. Didn't go the way they were hoping. The NATO bombing in Kosovo in 1999. So we really took this idea of humanitarian intervention and ran with it in the 90s. And hopefully, if you're paying attention to everything that's been going on in the lectures so far, this is not unexpected. What happened in 1989, 1990? Fall of the Soviet Union. What happened as a result of that? An opening of international, within country and around countries, space for the rise of NGOs, MNCs, international organizations. What happened as a result of that? The rise in special interests, the rise in human rights, the rise in protecting indigenous groups, protecting women, protecting children, etc., etc., etc. So you saw this explosion of humanitarian intervention as you also had fundamentally a shift in who are the primary actors on the world stage. It's not states anymore. We have all these NGOs and IOs and MNCs taking up space. So why not have states taking up space differently than they were before to engage in humanitarian intervention? We're already so depleting the idea of what sovereignty means. Let's just go ahead and crack that shell altogether and say, now your sovereignty is meaningless, especially if you're doing something that we don't like not feeding your people or gassing your own people. All right. So the last thing we'll talk about quickly here is, again, emerging out of this, out of the 1990s, we came up with this agenda called R2P, Responsibility to Protect. And it's this idea that coming out of 2001, it was a report published by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. And it's this idea that we have to fundamentally shift our focus away from states' rights, which is what the world has been framed on since the 1600s. You're with me on this. We've been talking about it all semester. This Westphalian concept of stateness from the 1600s, R2P fundamentally shifts that and says, we're not talking about states, we're talking about citizens. This should be very familiar from the human development lecture we did as well, human security and human development. We don't care about things like a state's GDP and the level to which that rises and falls. We care about PPP, purchasing power parity, actual income that people have, and whether that is rising and falling, because that's a better measure of actual life on the ground for people. And to quote Amartya Sen, people are what matters. Okay, so this R2P agenda really kicked off in the early 2000s, and it's this idea that we have the responsibility to prevent, to react, and to rebuild. So not only saying we're going to prevent atrocities from happening, we're going to react in a timely way when they do, and we are going to assist in the rebuilding process of human communities after an event happens, in the case of something like a famine where we can't stop it from happening, right? In some cases, we just can't. We can't control the weather. Go back to the climate change lecture. We can link this all together, right? It's all coming together. So the last thing I'll say here then, we'll end with, there is an R2P video. It's a little bit longer. It's 9 minutes. You don't watch the whole thing if you want. Don't watch the whole thing. Take a look at it though. It's linked down below. You can learn a little bit more about the R2P agenda. And from here, we'll transition into, we would have transitioned into some discussion. Go and take your quiz. There will be your quiz online. I'll have a discussion question there for you to be thinking about. But yeah, hopefully with this lecture, I meant for this one to be a little bit later in the semester because it really is a sense of all these pieces coming together of, you've got climate issues, you've got nationalism issues, you've got war and conflict and poverty and human security, and we're really seeing a transition post-Westphalian system into this new world order where it's not states, it's people. And yeah, hopefully you're seeing how everything kind of comes together here to this brand new world, this brave new world that we're in, where, hey, imagine that, people matter more than states, people matter more than governments. So anyway, comment down below if you have something to say. If you've got questions, comment down below. Otherwise, I'm hoping, again, I'm not sure, I'm hoping this will be the last one and that I will see you in person starting next week for nationalism. If not, I will see you like this for next week, and we will do our 2-part series on nationalism. All right, so have a great day.